In San Diego's upscale Marston Hills, the mornings were typically still, sprinklers clicking on in neat suburban synchrony, the sky already clean with coastal sun. But on November 5th, 1989, that stillness was broken at 6:32 a.m. by a 911 call that triggered an immediate dispatch. When officers entered 1041 Cypress Avenue, the residence of prominent attorney Daniel Broderick III and his wife Linda, what they found wasn't chaos. It was quiet. Too quiet. Inside the master bedroom, the scene was clinical in its violence. Two bodies lay in the bed, one male, one female. Both showed signs of having been shot at close range. The male victim, later confirmed as Daniel T. Broderick, was slumped partially off the bed. The female victim, Linda Colkina Broderick, remained on her side, covers twisted around her waist, a .38 caliber entry wound visible through her nightgown. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. Nothing had been ransacked. The alarm system hadn't tripped, and no neighbors reported hearing a thing. But the trajectory patterns on the walls and the powder burns on the sheets told a different story. The shooter had been precise, unhurried, and standing within feet of the bed. Detective David McGee arrived on scene at 6:51 a.m., responding to the call as part of San Diego's Major Crimes Division. McGee had seen domestic double homicides before, drug-related, revenge-driven, even contract killings. But this one didn't fit cleanly into any of those categories. He noted the position of the bodies, the absence of defensive wounds, and the two spent shell casings neatly aligned on the carpet. Execution style, he murmured to the forensic technician logging the scene. But the motive, unclear, at least for now. Preliminary identification was straightforward. Daniel Broderick had been a fixture in San Diego's legal community, known for his aggressive litigation style and high-profile malpractice defense work. His wife Linda, formerly a legal assistant, had recently married him after a multi-year relationship that began during Dan's previous marriage. That marriage, public, messy, and legally complex, was already well documented across civil court records. The name on those filings? Elizabeth Ann Broderick. Back at headquarters, forensic pathologist Dr. Lena Hart reviewed the scene photos before performing autopsies. Both victims had been shot with a .38 caliber revolver, likely Smith & Wesson based on casing impressions. Linda had been hit twice, one shot entering through the right temple, the other traversing the upper chest. Dan had sustained a single shot through the back, severing the thoracic aorta. Both died instantly. Toxicology results later confirmed both were sober. No sedatives, no alcohol, just routine traces of caffeine. The killer hadn't drugged them. They'd simply been sleeping. By midday, crime scene technicians turned up a partial muddy shoe print near the side entrance. Narrow heel, feminine sizing. No blood trail leading out, no fingerprints on the doorknob. But the door had been left ajar, and that mattered. The print was consistent with a women's size 7 loafer, not uncommon. But combined with the trajectory analysis, entry route, and angle of approach, it pointed to someone who knew the layout of the house, someone comfortable enough to walk straight into a bedroom in the dark. That detail stuck with McGee. This wasn't random, he told his partner. This was intimate. Somebody knew exactly where to go and exactly who they wanted to hit. That evening, the team pulled the house's landline records. One outgoing call had been placed at 6:12 a.m. to an unknown number, later linked to a teenager's phone belonging to one of Dan's children. The voice on the other end was described as shaken, female, and repeating the words, "I didn't mean to, it just happened." When the recording was played back to McGee, he didn't flinch, but he did pause before speaking. People don't just show up with a revolver and walk out calm unless they've thought about this for a long time. And if they didn't run, it's because they already knew where to go next. The forensic clock started ticking. Gunshot residue tests were pending. The ballistic matching process had already begun. A subpoena for surveillance cameras from neighboring houses was filed. But as the first 24 hours passed, the working theory was already forming, one built not just on blood spatter or bullet trajectory, but on years of court transcripts, threats, and increasingly erratic behavior from someone with everything to lose and everything to settle. The investigative team began constructing a timeline that would either confirm or contradict what the evidence was quietly implying. To do that, They needed context, clear, objective insight into who Dan and Linda Broderick really were outside the crime scene. Forensic analysis could tell them how the victims died. Civil records, depositions, and psychological evaluations would suggest why. Detective McGee ordered an expedited review of Dan Broderick's civil case files, including divorce proceedings, property disputes, and custody arrangements. The goal was to identify potential stressors, patterns of escalation, or threats that could precede a targeted homicide. What surfaced from the case archives painted a picture not of a man living in tranquility, but of a man who had spent the last 5 years entangled in one of the most bitter, high-conflict divorces in California family court history. Daniel Broderick III had been married to Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known to most as Betty, for 16 years. They shared 4 children in a history that began when they were both students at Cornell. By 1985, Dan was a high-powered malpractice attorney with a lucrative client base. Betty had left her teaching career and, by all accounts, dedicated herself fully to raising the family. According to court records, the fracture began when Dan hired a 21-year-old former flight attendant named Linda Kolkina as his legal assistant. He denied an affair at first. Betty didn't believe him. The divorce filing came in 1986. What followed wasn't merely contentious, it was hostile. Betty contested everything: financial control, custody, even the validity of Dan's retirement projections. Thousands of pages of depositions revealed allegations of psychological abuse, stonewalling, and retaliatory behavior. Betty accused Dan of using his legal influence to manipulate court timelines and minimize her settlement. Dan, in return, claimed Betty was unstable, vindictive, and unfit to share custody. In a deposition dated July 1988, Betty stated, "He knows the law better than anyone, and he's using it like a weapon. I have nothing left to defend myself with." That sentence, filed in an affidavit now part of the case review, caught McGee's attention. "This isn't just about money," he noted aloud during an interagency debrief. "This is about control, legal, personal, emotional. That always changes how people behave in the aftermath." The investigative unit turned next to digital records. Dan Broderick had a private office in downtown San Diego. Forensic IT specialists recovered fragments from his office computers and personal devices. One folder, recently deleted but restored via metadata tracking, contained drafts of restraining order requests, communications with a private security firm, and personal journal entries. The content was direct. Linda had expressed increasing anxiety over Betty's unpredictable behavior. One entry read, "She left another voicemail today, said she'd take back what's hers. Dan thinks it's just anger. I'm not so sure." Investigators subpoenaed phone records for the month prior to the murders. They uncovered over 40 calls from Betty's residence to Dan and Linda's home. Most went unanswered. 3 were answered. 2 were documented with profanity-laced messages. One, recorded by Linda on a portable answering machine, simply said, "Don't get comfortable." Legally, Betty had been barred from setting foot on the property since 1988, but property records showed she had previously lived in the same house with Dan. The layout hadn't changed. Her knowledge of the floor plan, access points, and security vulnerabilities was precise. The prosecution would later cite this familiarity as a critical point of premeditation. Forensic review of the alarm logs from the Broderick home indicated a silent deactivation sequence had been entered sometime before 6:00 a.m. on November 5th. The alarm provider cross-referenced that deactivation code with historical entries. It matched an older sequence used by Betty prior to the divorce, never changed by Dan after she moved out. That oversight, seemingly minor, allowed an armed individual to bypass the alarm, move through the kitchen hallway, and enter the bedroom without alerting the system. It explained the absence of alarms. It also underscored something deeper. There had been confidence in the security, but no contingency for betrayal. Detective McGee noted in his log, "The threat wasn't unknown, it was discounted. That's what made it lethal." The evidence was beginning to form a coherent pattern. Forensic science revealed the method. Legal history revealed the motive. Surveillance wasn't available. Dan had not installed any external cameras, and neighboring properties either had no coverage or faced away from his home. However, corroborated testimony from a housekeeper confirmed the back entrance often remained unlocked until Linda rose in the morning. This small oversight, combined with the old alarm code, tightened the suspect list dramatically. But before conclusions could be drawn, one more layer had to be addressed: emotional escalation. Forensic psychologists were brought in to review behavioral reports submitted by Betty's prior therapist. With court authorization, these records showed recurring patterns of obsessive ideation, unresolved anger, and a stated belief that she had been erased from her own life. In a recorded statement during a 1989 session, Betty said, "If I don't matter to them anymore, then why should they get to live like I never existed?" Investigators weren't drawing emotional conclusions, but those words, extracted and time-stamped weeks before the shooting, aligned uncomfortably well with the precision and timing of the murders. Not just a crime of passion, potentially a crime of calculation built on years of perceived disenfranchisement. In towns like San Diego, murders aren't just scenes to process. They fracture legal communities, reset families, and force institutions to re-examine the lines between law and emotion. The facts weren't fiction, but the implications would test how far the law could reach when rage had already crossed the threshold. By the morning of November 6th, the crime scene was no longer active, but it was far from cold. Evidence technicians had concluded the initial sweep, but the secondary forensic pass was underway. This phase prioritized the anomalies, details that didn't conform to standard patterns. Those inconsistencies, if read properly, could distinguish premeditation from panic, intrusion from familiarity. Detective McGee ordered the reprocessing of trace evidence near the threshold of the master bedroom. Using oblique lighting and electrostatic lifting film, a latent footprint, previously overlooked, was collected. Its ridge depth indicated minimal pressure, likely from someone walking slowly and deliberately. The print matched the same size and pattern as the shoe print lifted near the side entrance. The sole was consistent with an older Ferragamo loafer, women's size 7.5. While commercially common, it matched shoes previously photographed during a civil deposition 2 years earlier, worn by Dan's former spouse. Crime scene report, NUD 142B, filed at 10:24 a.m., noted that no signs of forced entry were present at any door or window. However, analysis of the side entry door frame revealed microscopic abrasions around the locking bolt. A forensic locksmith examined the wear pattern and confirmed the lock had been turned cleanly from the outside by someone with a key or precise knowledge of the mechanism. There was no sign of struggle, no pried surfaces. The point of entry had been used calmly. The bedding told its own story. Both victims were in sleepwear. The sheets were rumpled but undisturbed. No drag marks, no overturned furniture. This detail supported the theory that the victims were shot while asleep or just beginning to awaken. The entry wounds, mapped by Dr. Hart, indicated a high level of control and confidence. The shooter had targeted vital areas with no wasted motion. Blood spatter analysis confirmed close-range discharges with minimal blowback. The barrel of the revolver was within 18 inches of each victim at the time of firing. Linda's wounds showed the presence of stippling, tiny burns from gunpowder residue, further confirming the proximity. No defensive wounds were found on either body. No foreign DNA was recovered under the nails. No bruising. The attack was immediate, decisive, and without warning. In reviewing the hallway leading to the master suite, technicians noted a single faint smear along the wainscoting. It measured approximately 5.5 inches in height, angled upward. Chemical testing revealed it was a partial fingerprint in transfer, likely from someone steadying themselves briefly against the wall. AFIS analysis would take weeks, but the placement suggested movement through the house in total darkness. Detectives also reviewed a digital inventory of personal belongings inside the home. Linda's purse remained untouched on the nightstand. Dan's wallet was inside a drawer, cash and credit cards intact. Jewelry on the dresser had not been disturbed. No electronics were taken. A cold-blooded robbery would have had a signature. This scene had none. The timeline began to narrow. If the entry occurred between 5:45 and 6 a.m., and the 911 call was placed at 6:32 a.m., that left a precise window of time for the shooter to enter, fire, and exit without detection. The shooter knew how long they had and what route to take. That timing reinforced the possibility that this wasn't just someone acting on impulse. It was someone who had waited, possibly for years. Forensic psychologists conducted a post-incident behavioral reconstruction based on available records. They flagged a pattern commonly observed in emotionally driven homicides involving intimate partners. The indicators were not circumstantial. They were systemic. Years of documented threats, sudden withdrawal from previous social circles, claims of betrayal reframed as justification. The shooter, they noted, did not exhibit signs of post-crime panic. The exit route was clean. The weapon had not been recovered, but no sloppy disposal attempt had yet been found. That, too, was telling. Detective McGee made a notation in the master case file. Too many things went exactly as expected. That's not chance. That's planning. At the county courthouse, subpoenas were filed for additional surveillance data from businesses near the suspect's residence. License plate reader data was retrieved from traffic cameras located at two intersections along the route between her home and Dan's. A 1987 gray Chevy Suburban, matching a vehicle registered under the suspect's name, was logged at 5:36 a.m., passing through Laurel Canyon Drive. Time stamped, no passengers. Direction, southeast, toward the Broderick residence. This was the first piece of objective, time-stamped movement evidence directly linking the suspect to the crime window. Meanwhile, victimology analysis continued. Linda Colkina Broderick had no criminal history, no known disputes beyond the conflict with her husband's ex-wife. She had never filed restraining orders or police reports. But in a handwritten note found in her nightstand drawer and dated just 2 weeks before the murders, she had written, "If anything happens, it will be her." Investigators didn't rely on instinct. They followed evidence. But sometimes, even in the silence of a crime scene, the people who could no longer speak left behind something that still could. In a homicide investigation, the evidence inside a crime scene speaks first. But the context surrounding that scene, the years of conflict, the patterns of behavior, the escalation others missed, speaks louder. Detective McGee shifted focus from what was found inside the Broderick home to what had unfolded outside of it. He and his team began reconstructing the psychological trajectory of the suspect through verified court records, documented incidents, and corroborated third-party accounts. The aim wasn't motive in a dramatic sense. It was threat assessment mapped in hindsight. The data had to explain the method. Between 1986 and 1989, law enforcement logged over a dozen non-emergency calls involving the suspect and Daniel Broderick. Most were classified under civil disturbances or family disputes. None resulted in formal charges. However, internal memos from the San Diego Police Department documented repeated visits to the Broderick residence, reports of property damage, verbal threats, and one instance where the front entryway had been spray painted with the word liar in red. That vandalism incident, initially dismissed as impulsive, had forensic relevance. Photos from the scene confirmed the spray paint can was left behind. A print recovered on the nozzle matched the suspect's right thumb, confirming presence and intent. The same behavior pattern, direct confrontation, followed by immediate retreat, appeared again months later when the suspect reportedly drove her vehicle through Dan's front door. The damage estimate was over $5,000. Civil charges were filed but later dropped during settlement negotiations. The escalation wasn't random, it was linear. Linda Colkina, then Dan's fiancée, had reported multiple phone messages containing explicit language and threats. Transcripts entered into evidence during the custody dispute documented phrases like, "You'll be sorry," and "I hope you choke on your happiness." The suspect admitted to making the calls during sworn deposition, but described them as emotional outbursts, not threats. No restraining order was granted. At the time, verbal harassment in California family court rarely resulted in enforceable protective measures unless accompanied by physical harm or criminal trespass. This procedural gap, while legally standard for the era, left the victims unshielded despite their warnings. Forensic psychiatry consultants reviewed psychological evaluations from a 1988 custody hearing. According to the court-appointed clinician's notes, the suspect exhibited symptoms consistent with borderline personality traits: abandonment sensitivity, impulsive reactions under stress, and distorted perceptions of betrayal. These were clinical observations, not legal diagnoses, but they provided insight into how perception can override fact in a high-conflict domestic setting. A family law associate interviewed under subpoena recalled an off-the-record conversation where the suspect allegedly stated, "He rewrote our history without asking. That's not something I'll let go quietly." The associate documented the exchange contemporaneously in her case notes. She later admitted to not taking the comments seriously. At the time, it read as bitterness, not warning. The investigative team obtained calendar entries from the suspect's personal planner, submitted during divorce proceedings. Notably, the date of Dan and Linda's wedding was marked not with a note or reminder, but with a single word: end. That wedding had occurred less than 7 months before the murder. Linda's friends, in statements to police, described increasing caution in the weeks leading up to the incident. One friend recalled Linda purchasing new exterior locks and motion lights. Another said Linda had planned to ask Dan to install a home security camera system, but hadn't yet followed through. When people feel unsafe, they don't always make it obvious. They change routines. They avoid eye contact. They check doors twice instead of once. The Broderick files showed those behaviors, but not early enough, not comprehensively, and not with enough legal force to prevent what came next. From a procedural standpoint, the evidence now supported a hypothesis of cumulative behavior consistent with targeted domestic escalation. There had been ample pre-incident indicators: verbal threats, property damage, emotional destabilization, and direct access to the victim's personal environment. Each was documented. None were formally escalated through the legal system. For prosecutors, the question would no longer be whether the suspect acted deliberately. It would be how long she had been preparing, and how many warning signs were missed or ignored along the way. As McGee summarized in his report, there are cases where a single moment triggers the crime. This wasn't one of them. In communities like San Diego, where civil order is often assumed to be a default, there's a danger in overlooking rage that wears a familiar face. It doesn't always break in. It's already been given a key. The shift from behavioral analysis to tactical collection began immediately after the escalation profile was completed. By now, investigators weren't chasing theories. They were validating known paths with physical evidence. A warrant was issued for the suspect's vehicle, the gray 1987 Chevrolet Suburban previously logged by a traffic camera near Laurel Canyon Drive the morning of the murders. The vehicle was impounded without incident. A forensic team performed a full trace examination. Swabs taken from the steering wheel and gear shift revealed no blood, but latent print powder highlighted several partials, consistent with the suspect's known fingerprints. Nothing new there. What mattered more were the fibers. Vacuum samples pulled from the floorboard beneath the driver's seat yielded beige polyester strands. These matched the carpeting found in the Broderick residence hallway. A second set, light blue in color, matched Linda Kolkina's bedsheet fabric. While circumstantial, this alignment was significant in forensic sequencing. The car had been used shortly after the scene had been entered and exited, with physical transfer indicating proximity to key rooms inside the house. A second search was executed at the suspect's residence. Inside a hallway closet, law enforcement recovered a pair of worn Ferragamo loafers, size 7.5. The soles matched the print lifted near the side entrance of the crime scene, down to the abrasion pattern on the right heel. Forensic comparison scored the match at 92% certainty, well above admissibility thresholds in California courts at the time. Investigators noted dried mud consistent with the lawn at the Broderick residence, based on soil comparison samples. Chain of custody was documented, and the shoes were entered into evidence. The murder weapon had not yet been recovered, but ballistics lab testing on the shell casings from the scene confirmed that all 3 rounds had been fired from the same revolver, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, likely a Model 36. California gun registration databases showed that the suspect had purchased a weapon of that model in 1982. At the time, there was no requirement to re-register privately owned firearms annually. That weapon had not been reported stolen or disposed of. A search for the firearm was added to the second warrant. No gun was found at the suspect's property. The lead investigator filed a request to search nearby parkland and storm drains within a 2-mile radius, starting from a known jogging route the suspect frequented. No weapon turned up in that pass. The gun was presumed to have been discarded elsewhere, or possibly handed off. Still, in the context of physical access, ballistic alignment, and motive, the case was coalescing. Investigators re-examined the 911 call that had first alerted authorities. The voice on the line was shaky, female, and placed from a payphone 6 blocks from the crime scene. Acoustic enhancement ruled out background traffic, suggesting a residential zone. Based on timestamps and cross-street logs, the call was made 18 minutes after the estimated time of death. While the caller never identified herself, voice recognition software later provided a high-confidence match to the suspect's voice based on prior tape depositions. Meanwhile, digital forensic teams obtained call logs from the suspect's landline and answering machine. Among them were messages received from Dan and Linda in the weeks before the attack. Most were short, mundane, but one message stood out. Dated 2 weeks prior, it simply said, "I know you're still angry, but you're not helping anyone." While not threatening, its tone confirmed ongoing tension. It provided context to the increasingly direct actions of the suspect, already recorded in previous filings. Each element, vehicle placement, fabric transfer, ballistic match, footwear recovery, and call tracing, tightened the evidentiary net. Not through conjecture, but through a clear forensic map of movement, contact, and access. Detective McGee noted in his supplemental report, "We're not building a story, we're documenting a sequence." There's a critical distinction in cases like this. Emotion can explain motive, but it can't substitute for proof. That's why investigators deal in transfer evidence, timestamps, and certifiable trajectory. It's not enough to know someone had reason. You have to show they had reach. Still, in all this, there was an overlooked detail that struck one analyst: a child's school folder left in the front seat of the suspect's Suburban. The date scrawled on the top page was November 3rd. The folder had remained in the vehicle during the crime window. It meant one thing: the suspect hadn't removed it. There had been no frantic cleaning, no attempt to erase presence, which to the team didn't signal carelessness, it signaled confidence. That's what made it dangerous. By early December 1989, the physical evidence had been logged, the suspect had been arraigned, and the case was ready for prosecutorial structuring. But unlike standard homicides, the Broderick case was never just about who pulled the trigger. That part was becoming increasingly clear. The challenge now lay in framing why and determining whether the court would see it as murder in the second degree or something less, diluted by years of provocation and unresolved emotional war. The district attorney's office initiated the discovery phase, requesting access to all psychiatric evaluations previously submitted in civil custody hearings, including sealed portions that had not been entered into public record. A judge approved the motion under the argument that prior mental health assessments bore directly on the suspect's capacity and potential intent at the time of the killings. The defense objected, but was overruled. Prosecutors reviewed notes from a 1988 forensic psychologist who had flagged signs of compulsive anger, boundary collapse, and dissociative episodes during periods of perceived humiliation. These records weren't speculative. They were court-mandated assessments entered during child custody litigation. No diagnosis of psychosis was made. No medications had been prescribed. This positioned the prosecution to pursue a case built on deliberate premeditation, not temporary insanity. Meanwhile, search warrant results continued to refine the state's theory. A receipt surfaced from a gas station less than a mile from the Broderick residence, time-stamped 5:48 a.m. on the day of the crime, paid in cash. The security camera had no visual record, but handwriting on the pump log matched the suspect's known print style. This timestamp now narrowed the final timeline window to just minutes. The gun still hadn't been found. Prosecutors anticipated the defense might argue the absence of the murder weapon as a reasonable doubt gap, but California precedent allowed for conviction without the firearm if circumstantial and forensic evidence met the burden of proof. That bar had been cleared with physical fiber transfers, shoe print matching, ballistic shell casings, and the suspect's recorded movement through digital and timestamp data. A mock jury pool was consulted in preparation for the high-profile nature of the trial. Public sentiment was already fracturing. Local media portrayed the case in two parallel tracks, one of brutal double homicide, the other of a woman pushed to psychological collapse. National coverage leaned into the narrative of marital betrayal and the legal system's failure to protect both sides from spiraling tension. Prosecutors ignored the noise. Their role was not to assign emotional justification, it was to align acts with law. Every element had to show not just who acted, but when the line between emotion and execution had been crossed. Witness lists were compiled. Law enforcement officers, forensic analysts, Linda Kolkina's close friends, and two of Dan's legal partners were included. The prosecution planned to call the responding officer to describe the condition of the scene, in contrast to how a spontaneous act might present. They would lean heavily on evidence of controlled entry, targeted shots, and the absence of disarray. They would show, step by step, how the crime reflected planning, not panic. The defense moved to suppress certain psychological reports, citing prejudicial impact. The judge allowed limited redaction but kept the overall profiles admissible. The defense also requested bifurcation of the trial, separating guilt from sanity phases. That request was denied. The trial would proceed as one unit, with mental state considered within the context of the act. A pretrial hearing focused on the suspect's access to the home. The key code entry and the reuse of an old alarm code were cited as critical points of unlawful entry. The defense attempted to argue implied permission due to past cohabitation. That argument was dismantled when prosecutors presented documentation showing Dan had formally removed the suspect from the property deed and had established a restraining request, even if it hadn't been granted. Throughout these hearings, the suspect remained largely silent. No formal statement was issued to the press. Courtroom observers noted a detached demeanor. The prosecution didn't comment on this, but investigators took note. In high-conflict domestic cases, post-offense behavior often carries just as much evidentiary weight as the act itself. What emerged during this phase was a case no longer resting on a single night, but one built from years of accumulation, with each document, call, and ignored red flag forming a lattice beneath the event. The justice system often moves slower than public opinion. But in a case like this, speed was secondary. What mattered was precision, making sure no piece of evidence was presented without chain of custody, no motive was assumed without record, and no conclusion drawn without verification. In cases where emotion threatens to eclipse fact, clarity is what the law demands. And in this case, it was being constructed, layer by procedural layer. Opening statements commenced on October 22, 1990, in a packed San Diego courtroom. Jury selection had taken over a week, with special considerations given to potential bias due to local media saturation. The presiding judge issued a gag order barring commentary from attorneys outside formal proceedings. From the outset, both prosecution and defense acknowledged one fact. Two people were dead, and the woman seated at the defense table had shot them. The trial would turn not on what happened, but on why, and whether the act aligned with second-degree murder or could be mitigated to a lesser offense. The prosecution's opening argument framed the killings as deliberate and executed with knowledge, access, and opportunity. The timeline was laid out precisely. They emphasized the early morning entry, the silence of the scene, the precise placement of bullets, and the lack of resistance. Each action, they argued, reflected control, not emotional disintegration. The first witnesses called were officers who had arrived at the crime scene. Their testimonies were technical, supported by photos and diagrams. They described the position of the bodies, the directionality of blood spatter, and the orientation of shell casings. One noted the absence of any forced entry, aligning with the prosecution's assertion that the suspect had used an old alarm code. The medical examiner was next. She confirmed that both victims had died instantly. Linda had been shot once in the head, once in the chest. Dan had been shot in the back. She presented autopsy photos, noting stippling and gunpowder residue. All shots were consistent with close-range firing, with no hesitation wounds or erratic patterns. The defense began its counter-strategy by presenting the suspect not as a calculating murderer, but as a woman under extreme emotional and psychological duress. They leaned heavily on the years-long contentious divorce, the public humiliation, the loss of custody, and the perception, real or imagined, of being systemically erased from her own life. They admitted she fired the gun but argued diminished capacity due to a psychological break. Psychologists took the stand for both sides. The prosecution's experts cited behavioral patterns from depositions, property damage incidents, and recorded threats, asserting that the suspect's conduct before the crime demonstrated sustained focus, not confusion. The defense's expert focused on cumulative trauma, isolation, and untreated mental health indicators. He noted previous court-recommended therapy sessions that were never mandated or completed. The prosecution introduced physical evidence next: the recovered footwear, the fiber match, the gas station logbook, and the ballistic match to a revolver the suspect had purchased years prior. Even though the weapon had not been found, every other element of the firing sequence was accounted for. They then played a recording from the 911 call placed after the killings. The voice was soft, disoriented, and without confession. While the defense used this to suggest remorse and confusion, the prosecution highlighted how the caller never identified herself, only placing the call from a payphone and disappearing. The most compelling testimony came from one of Dan's legal partners. He described an escalating concern over the suspect's behavior in the months before the murders. He mentioned conversations where Dan expressed fear that legal protection wasn't enough. The judge allowed these statements over objection under California's state of mind exception. This allowed the jury to hear Dan's anticipation of harm, not as dramatic foreshadowing, but as documented unease. Through all this, the suspect remained quiet. No outbursts, no breakdowns. The courtroom observed her demeanor carefully. Jurors watched for flickers of regret or resentment. Her attorney instructed her not to testify. The defense closed by stating the suspect had acted out of profound despair, not evil. But prosecutors had stacked a chain of verified actions, each grounded in physical evidence, to prove otherwise. Their case didn't rely on opinion. It followed the trail of keys, fibers, casings, and timing. Some trials hinge on charisma. This one hinged on chain of custody. On December 11, 1991, after less than 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The courtroom remained silent as the charges were read. The defense did not dispute the act, only its classification. But the jury had accepted the prosecution's framing, that planning, access, and composure overrode emotional collapse. The sentencing phase followed in January. The judge imposed the maximum under California law, 32 years to life, 10 years for each count of murder, with an additional enhancement for firearm use. The sentence reflected not only the severity of the crime, but the degree of deliberation involved. No mitigating factors were found sufficient to reduce the charge. No parole eligibility until at least 2010. There were appeals. None were successful. The original conviction and sentence were upheld across all judicial reviews. Following incarceration, the suspect gave sporadic interviews. She never denied the killings, but framed them as inevitable consequences of emotional erasure. Still, no formal diagnosis of mental illness had been accepted by the court, and no remorse consistent with rehabilitation was recorded in parole board summaries. As of this writing, she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women. The Broderick case did not result in a legislative overhaul, but it did influence how courts began to reassess emotional abuse in custody battles and how threats, verbal or indirect, are weighed in preemptive legal protection. It highlighted a legal blind spot: when psychological decline accumulates in plain sight, but the threshold for criminal intervention remains reactive, not preventive. Dan and Linda Broderick's families have remained largely private since the verdict. Their children were left to reconcile opposing legacies: the victims' lives and the actions of their mother. For the public, the case became a cautionary fixture in true crime archives. For law enforcement, it reinforced a procedural truth: domestic homicides rarely begin with violence. They begin with patterns that are ignored until it's too late. Justice in this case was procedural, not emotional. The facts aligned. The law followed, but the human cost remains permanent. I've told you this story not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remind you, silence doesn't mean safety, and emotional wounds left untreated can turn into something irreversible. As someone who's seen this play out, too late, I can say this: if you see the signs, don't ignore them. Speak up. Protect your boundaries. Choose peace before control becomes a weapon. What do you think? Can the justice system ever fully account for emotional decay before it leads to harm? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. If this story moved you or made you reflect, please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's next. If you didn't like it, tell me why and where you're watching from. Let's learn from each other.